Well, as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of discussion, pleas, demands, prayers in some cases, ahead of the budget speech by the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni on Wednesday. Also, speculation about whether he's going to get money from. You'll remember government revenues hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis, and particularly the fact that governments lost a lot of tax revenue because alcohol and tobacco were not on sale for large portions of last year. You might remember the day before the budget last year, Mboweni told unions just before the budget speech government would not implement the last increase of the multi-year wage agreement. Tony Healy is a Labour expert. He joins us now. Tony, good afternoon to you. We all know that this minister, Tito Mboweni, is prepared to take on the public sector unions. Do you expect him to have another bash during his budget?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, I do. I think he's one of the he's perhaps one of the few rays of hope when it comes to cabinet members that seem to be sufficiently willing to be disciplined enough to curtail public spending. So I fully expect him in the budget tomorrow to continue to present a case that says the wage freeze must continue.
I mean, part of the legality, part of the issue around this is the legality, and this went to the Labour Appeal Court, and government won that round, and I suspect some of the union leaders were probably quite surprised, probably quite shocked if you read the judgment. I imagine that gives Mboweni some room in which to move.
Yes, look, I myself was a little surprised at that Labour Appeal Court finding, but of course we need to remember that it is now being referred to the Constitutional Court in all likelihood. 8 odd unions are public sector unions are presented affidavits, and time will tell where we land on that particular issue. But be that as it may, I think one thing is for sure that I think perhaps the Constitutional Court will uphold that finding, and that we're in for a heck of a ride when it comes to the current round of public sector wage negotiations.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is sort of, poisoned the well in a way, hasn't it? If you and the unions have, I think for perhaps their own reasons, been very careful to say that this is an attack on public sector bargaining. In other words, this is an attack by government on the entire system.
Yes, they're saying, you know what, how can you in good faith apparently sign a wage deal and then in the third year argue that, we didn't actually have a mandate to do so. So that is a concern, but so are the public coffers, and we clearly just don't have the money to spend on these kinds of increases. I think what's also important, Stephen, is the fact that what is interesting presently is that there seems to be a degree of fragmentation among the public sector unions in terms of not only how to deal with that particular dispute, but also how to deal with the new round of wage negotiations that should have commenced already. For the first time in a very long time, we're seeing a fragmentation of those public sector unions and big disagreements on what kinds of strategies should be adopted and what kind of wage increases should be demanded in the new round of wage negotiations.
Are those disputes sort of along what you'd call federation lines, COSATU unions going one way, FEDUSA unions going another?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. You'll see, for example, FEDUSA will be looking at a CPI plus 1% kind of increase, and other more hawkish unions and federations looking for in the region of 10%, which sounds bizarre in the current set of circumstances. But it is going to be an intriguing feature of the new round of public sector wage negotiations, which I would expect are nonetheless going to deadlock, because I don't see Tito Mboweni capitulating on this.
I mean, I don't know what word to use. A demand for a 10% wage increase in 2021 after everything we've going for is bonkers. I mean, it's mad. I mean, it's utterly mad.
Bonkers. Yeah, bonkers, farcical, dreamland, out of touch with reality. You can continue. The public sector unions will argue that they haven't had an increase for a couple of years, and many of them are frontline workers. So that's the kind of argument that you hear, but many of them aren't. My sense is that government will not be compelled to pay the third year of the previous wage deal, and we're in for a really turbulent time when it comes to the public sector wage collective bargaining process in the next 12 months.
You made the point that many workers are frontline workers and many are not. So, I mean, just as an example, many are nurses, and I think most of us would probably agree that they could do with a 20% pay rise, frankly. Many are people who maybe work in home affairs, they're pretty efficient at the moment. Maybe they work in the driver's license centres in Gauteng, and their own MEC says that they aren't efficient. And in fact, he's launching all sorts of investigations into corruption. It would really help government if it could differentiate between all of these workers. I mean, that would certainly help it in the court of public opinion, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, and not just differentiate in terms of those vocations, Stephen, but be able to pay some sort of performance-related increases, which is really anathema to trade unions, generally speaking, because they want the very best of performers to receive the same increase as the very worst of performers, and for there to be no differentiation when it comes to performance. But I mean, if we could differentiate in terms of vocations and differentiate in terms of performance, then they may get a more receptive ear from government. But the fact of the matter is that the Treasury is so cash-strapped at the moment for the reasons we're all aware of. The money simply isn't there. And there's been talk if the public sector unions were to get their way, South Africa could really fall off a debt cliff in terms of its obligations with regards to its borrowings that it has had to really accumulate over many years. We must remember that we've had a negative deficit for about the last 11, 12 years, since plus minus more or less the time that President Zuma appeared on the scene as our president.
It seems that the sort of wage gap between what people are paid in the public sector and people paid in the private sector has grown, and particularly last year, because government workers, I think almost all of them, really didn't lose any income. In fact, I think there were one or two government institutions that have pointed this out, whereas private sector workers often did. Does that weaken the case of the public sector unions in the court of public opinion? I mean, certainly, very difficult to know by listening to this or looking on Twitter or whatever it is, but you get a sense that the public sector unions don't, and COSATU generally, obviously, don't have quite the support they used to have.
Look, the fact of the matter is that we have a far greater union density in the public sector than we have in the private sector. We have only 1 in 8 union members across both sectors, but that is heavily skewed in favor of public sector unions, who have benefited from large CPI plus large percentage increases, probably because of largely because of their allegiance with the ruling party that's in government. But those chickens are coming home to roost, and people like Tito Mboweni are amongst those in cabinet who have recognized this, and perhaps it's too late, perhaps it isn't, but is finally willing to take the unions on in terms of these extraordinary increases above CPI that they've enjoyed over many years.
It's fascinating you talk about Tito Mboweni in this way, because, if we look at the ministers before him, so before Tito Mboweni and Nhlanhla Nene warned about the rising wage bill, I think Malusi Gigaba did. Before him, well, Nhlanhla Nene did, Pravin Gordhan did, Nhlanhla Nene did, and Pravin Gordhan did, if you see where I'm going with this. The point I'm making is that this has been a warning for many years, and Mboweni is acting. Is it just because the numbers are so bad?
I think so, Stephen. I think, Mr. Mboweni will know that politically taking on the unions is not going to be great from a votes point of view. But as you've also pointed out, union membership is dropping, and the question really is, to what extent does the ANC really need and rely upon fewer and fewer union or COSATU members in order to keep them in power? I'm not a politician, but one thing I do recognize as someone who works in the labor field is that I think it's a positive. It's good news to see a finance minister who's willing to be much more prudent when it comes to spending on wages in the public sector.
Imagine if Becky and Charlie were here, you would have a different view. Tony Healy, thanks very much indeed, the Labour expert.